Hello everyone. This lecture is on part 1 of The Plague by Albert Camus. The novel begins by setting up a series of contrasts which will have an enduring importance for the rest of the novel. Let us look at it together. Quote, "The unusual events described in this chronicle occurred in 1940 at Oran. Everyone agreed that, considering their somewhat extraordinary character, they were out of place there. For its ordinariness is what strikes one first about the town of Oran, which is merely a large French port on the Algerian coast, headquarters of the prefect of a French department." Unquote. So here we have unusual, extraordinary events versus the ordinariness of this town called Oran. This seemingly simple contrast is developed with quite a lot of sophistication. Let's go on then. What follows is a long passage that I believe it is worth reading closely. Quote, "Perhaps the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance is to ascertain how the people in it work, how they love, and how they die. In our little town, is this, one wonders, an effect of the climate? All three are done on much the same lines, with the same feverish yet casual air. The truth is that everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. Our citizens work hard, but solely with the object of getting rich. Their chief interest is in commerce, and their chief aim in life is, as they call it, doing business. Naturally, they don't eschew such simpler pleasures as lovemaking, sea bathing, going to the pictures. But very sensibly, they reserve these pastimes for Saturday afternoons and Sundays, and employ the rest of the week in making money, as much as possible. In the evening, on leaving the office, they foregather, at an hour that never varies, in the cafes, and stroll the same boulevard or take the air on their balconies. The passions of the young are violent and short-lived, and the vices of older men seldom range beyond an addiction to bowling, to banquets and socials, or clubs where large sums change hands on the fall of a card." Unquote. Right at the beginning, we have three categories of activities that define life, and the narrator is saying that they apply to the people of Oran. The three activities are work, love, and death. What's interesting is that all three are done more or less in the same manner. He adds that the climate may have something to do with it. There's the heat and the ocean. We've already seen that combination in The Stranger. What's more interesting is the truth that everybody is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. Boredom and habits are indeed two keywords that resurface throughout the novel. Why are they bored? Because they devote their lives to commerce, doing business, and making money. They devote all 5.5 days of the week to doing business, and then the remaining time on weekend to benign, modest pleasures, which are precisely what the narrator calls habits. Then he adds an interesting remark about the young and the old. You may notice a note of cynicism there. The people of Oran, young or old, are bored, and as such also boring. They have little in the way of mad pursuit of anything. Everything is regulated, and as such, unremarkable. They have no ideals, only the goal of making money in the main, and having a little fun on the side." Let us continue. Quote, "It will be said, no doubt, that these habits are not peculiar to our town. Really, all our contemporaries are much the same." Unquote. Although the narrator wants to make a point about the town of Oran, what he ends up offering is a picture of what he calls our contemporaries, meaning people who are living in this same historical era, that is, as we know, the mid-20th century. Let's keep that in mind. Continuing on, quote, "Certainly nothing is commoner nowadays than to see people working from morn till night and then proceeding to fritter away at card tables, in cafes, and in small talk what time is left for living. Nevertheless, there still exists towns and countries where people have now and then an inkling of something different. In general, it doesn't change their lives. Still, they have had an intimation, and that's so much to the good." Unquote. So our contemporaries work mainly, and then fritter away whatever time is left at trivial hobbies. And yet, there still exist towns and countries where people are not like that, or at least not entirely so. Not that they do anything remarkably different from these other more normal, regular contemporaries. It's simply that they have an inkling of something different. That's why he says it doesn't change their lives, but they have an intimation of something different. Once again, take note, the difference between the two groups of people is not striking, but subtle. Yet, this little difference makes all the difference, so to speak, as we will see. Of Oran, the narrator says this, quote, "Oran, however, seems to be a town without intimations. In other words, completely modern." Unquote. This is very important. Why? Because he has named the contemporary era, that is, modern. The whole description we have followed so far is a description of modernity or modern people. The exceptional few who he mentioned then, as the logic goes, they may not be completely modern. It doesn't mean that they are pre-modern in the sense of old-fashioned or even primitive, but merely that they have a position or outlook on the world that is not completely defined by modernity. Let us continue with the passage. Quote, "Hence, I see no need to dwell on the manner of loving in our town. The men and women consume one another rapidly in what is called the act of love, or else settle down to a mild habit of conjugality. We seldom find the mean between these two extremes. That too is not exceptional. At Oran, as elsewhere, for lack of time and thinking, people have to love one another without knowing much about it." Unquote. This is already a very powerful description of modern life. Men and women, presumably in love, do little more than consume themselves in the act of love or settle down in the habit of conjugality. They don't have time to love, so they don't know how to love. The narrator continues his critical yet sympathetic description of the town. Quote, "What is more exceptional in our town is the difficulty one may experience there in dying. Difficulty perhaps is not the right word. Discomfort would come nearer. Being ill is never agreeable, but there are towns that stand by you, so to speak, when you're sick, in which you can, after a fashion, let yourself go." Unquote. So the consequence is that an invalid feels out of it there in this town. So this is a remarkable way of describing a place. There are places that stand by you when you're ill, and there are towns and places that fail to do so. What he's saying is that in Oran, as in all modern towns, people do not stand by others, especially the ones who are ill. That is the gist of the modern city. But it's not really that bad, as the narrator says. Quote, however, we must not exaggerate. Really, all that was to be conveyed was the banality of the town's appearance and of life in it. But you can get through the days there without trouble, once you have formed habits. And since habits are precisely what our town encourages, all is for the best. Unquote. So habits are the savior of the bored people of the modern town of Oran. One good point of this boring town, or one more good point of this boring town, of this boring life that moderns lead, is as follows. Quote, viewed from this angle, its life is not particularly exciting, that must be admitted. But at least social unrest is quite unknown among us. And our frank-spoken, amiable, and industrious citizens have always inspired a reasonable esteem in visitors. Treeless, glamourless, soulless, the town of Oran ends by seeming restful, and after a while you go complacently to sleep there. Unquote. Once people form habits, they come to terms with their boring lives. They don't even really feel so bored because they get used to the pace of life where boredom is taken for granted as part of life and taken care of by way of habits. The good consequence is that people are not up to anything radical, so to speak. There's no social unrest. People are generally just amiable. They work hard and they're friendly. This supposedly positive effect is not really a compliment. There's no denying that the final sentence is rather scathing. Treeless, glamourless, soulless, people go complacently to sleep. Complacency basically means that one never thinks on one's own, never acts on one's own, but simply follows the path laid down by others. There's little dignity in this reasonable esteem that Oran inspires in visitors, we'll have to conclude. This takes us back to the whole point of this introduction. Quote, such being the normal life of Oran, it will be easily understood that our fellow citizens had not the faintest reason to apprehend the incidents that took place in the spring of the year in question, and were, as we subsequently realized, premonitory signs of the grave events we were to chronicle. To some, these events will seem quite natural. To others, all but incredible. Unquote. The point is that for these modern people who are used to a boring but harmless kind of life, the appearance of the plague is absolutely shocking. But some people do take it in stride, as we will see some examples later on. Even in this unremarkable town, there are some remarkable people who could take this rare crisis as but an episode of the order of nature. Let us now meet some of the main characters. Bernard Rieux, the main character, is a doctor in the center of the battle with the plague. Tarou is a bit of mystery at this point. He's from outside Oran. Rambert is a reporter from Paris. Grand, a clerk at the municipal office. Cottard is Grand's neighbor. He attempts suicide but is saved by Grand. Father Panelou has been introduced, but we do not see him in any action yet. Castel is Rieux's colleague, and Monsieur Auton is the police magistrate. And there are a couple of others who we will never meet directly, but appear several times to cross paths with the central characters. The asthma patient counts dried peas as a way of keeping time. A similarly strange character is the old man who daily comes out to his balcony to spit on cats. Among all these characters, it is Grand who draws much of textual attention in part 1 of the novel. I would even say that he may be the most interesting character of the whole novel, precisely because he seems to be the most interesting person, according to the narrator. Let's see how he is introduced. Quote, Grand's duties as clerk in the municipal office were varied, and he was sometimes employed in the statistical department on compiling the figures of births, marriages, and deaths. Thus, it had fallen to him to add up the number of deaths during the last few days, and being of an obliging disposition, he had volunteered to bring a copy of the latest figures to the doctor. Unquote. This is the context in which Grand meets Dr. Rieux. Grand, being a clerk in that department which gives statistical data on the population, reports to Rieux the daily numbers in relation to the plague. On his first appearance in the narrative, he makes some mysterious remarks. First, he announces, "My evenings are sacred." Rieux asks what he means, and Grand doesn't offer any further information. The only thing he would say is that he is working on his own account and volunteers an expression as a way of summing it up, the growth of a personality. One point that we might add here is that the growth of a personality doesn't quite sound like the habits that the narrator mentioned at the beginning of the novel. Rather than a habit, Grand's private work seems more like an effort with pride. Most interestingly, Rieux has the following reflection that positions Grand in the context of the plague. Quote, he's the kind of man who always escapes in such cases. Continuing on, quote, Rieux remembered having read somewhere that the plague spared weak constitutions and chose its victims chiefly among the robust. Still thinking of Grand, he decided that he was something of a mystery man in his small way. Unquote. Put in the terms introduced at the beginning of the novel, Rieux seems to have an inkling of something different, or he notices that Grand has an inkling of something different. Either way, Grand represents that inkling. He doesn't belong to the order of habits, life without inklings. In any case, we are treated to a very striking contradiction, Grand versus the plague. The question of how humans can fight against the plague would then have much to do with where Grand is situated in the scheme of things. This incommensurability between Grand and the plague will increasingly structure the textual concept of this world in crisis, Oran visited by the plague. Who is Joseph Grand? The most succinct summary of this character is, quote, he had all the attributes of insignificance, unquote. The description of his external circumstances and physical appearance is simple enough. His story is another matter. Grand took the current post, a temporary post, Quote, after obtaining a matriculation certificate beyond which, for lack of money, he was unable to progress, he was given his temporary post. He had been led to expect, or so he said, speedy confirmation in it. It was only a matter of proving his ability to cope with the delicate problems raised by the administration of our city. Once confirmed, they had assured him he couldn't fail to be promoted to a grade that would enable him to live quite comfortably, unquote. Instead, he has been in the same post ever since, that is all 22 years, because he couldn't find words to promote his case. Not that he lacks the intelligence to use words, he has all the functional capacities to use language, and yet he cannot find words. Put in a more conceptual way, without his intending it, somehow his existence has turned into a kind of protest against the singularly human condition, namely imposed language. We don't choose whether we learn language or not. By surviving infancy, by living beyond the animal state of the infant, by default, we choose to speak. It is in this sense that I propose to consider Kong's inability to find words as a form of existential protest. Now, it is not only that he can't find words. We have other reasons to believe that Kong has textual significance that goes to the heart of language as the existential condition par excellence. And the reasons follow. The narrator adds details of the peculiarity that is Kong's trouble with language. Quote, according to him, he felt a particular aversion from talking about his rights. The word was one that gave him pause, and likewise from mentioning a promise, which would have implied that he was claiming his due and thus bespoken an audacity incompatible with the humble post he filled, unquote. That he doesn't like to use the word rights is extremely interesting in the context of modernity of which we spoke earlier. Is not the concept of rights one of the fundamental precepts of modernity? For all of us, the concept of human rights, for instance, seems only natural. Yet, like all things, rights is a historical concept. It was constructed at a particular point of human history. What we know for sure is that it defines modern civilization that still continues in our times. Secondly, Kong doesn't like to use promise, the word promise, as the ground for any demands that he may have. The novel does not develop this idea further, but we can infer at least one point about it. When we demand that a promise be kept, we are demanding that the person who made the promise not change. It is not enough to say that the person should not change his or her mind, but the person literally must remain the same person in all aspects of his or her relation to the world. Why? Because a promise is made at a singular, contingent point of convergence of all conditions that define the person at that precise moment in time and place. There's always a bit of force involved in demanding that a promise be kept, because a promise can be kept only on the condition that the person remains the same, and no one remains the same. If this sounds abstract, you can consider how people make marriage vows and then break them. It would hardly be right to insist that they remain in their marriages just because they made the vows. So Kong's aversion to the word promise signals that he allows changes that invariably and inevitably happen, or that he refuses to insist otherwise. This is an existentialist attitude in the sense that existence means that an individual is always at the mercy of contingency. We already talked about chance and luck in the context of The Stranger. To insist that a promise be kept is to exclude the possibility, and indeed the necessity, that the person be subject to constantly evolving conditions of life. Now let us not jump to the easy judgment that Kong just doesn't know how to stand up for himself, that he lacks confidence, etc. Especially in our times, it is very easy to think that insisting on one's rights or demanding that promises be kept is an expression of self-respect. But without negating that assumption, we can still appreciate Kong's principled relation to the world. Moreover, the narrator adds further information that dispels any doubts about Kong's self-respect. Quote, on the other hand, he refused to use expressions such as your kindness, gratitude, or even solicit, which, to his thinking, were incompatible with his personal dignity, unquote. Not only is he averse to rights and promise, but he also refuses to use these very conventional expressions that we take for granted daily. With these two seemingly contradictory peculiarities, Kong in fact mirrors the contradiction that orders modern society in general. That is to say, we have double requirements to survive in modern society. We must insist on our rights on the one hand, and rely on others' power to help us on the other hand. We might feel empowered by our rights, but we also must seek to live by way of others' subjective attitudes to us. In other words, rights are never enough. Reason on which rights are supposedly based is not enough to explain reality. Rather, we often have to resort to affect, feelings, or attitudes of others which are never clear to us and frequently unreasonable. Put simply, rights and promises have to be supplemented with affective relations between the individuals. Thinking of these two aspects together, we can say that Kong, in his modest way, challenges the conventions of modern life. He is a bit of a stranger to modern civilization. We have seen this theme developed in The Stranger, especially in the courtroom. The law is supposed to be objective and universal, and yet the delivery of the law takes performative language that appeals to affect. Melso was finally condemned for refusing to participate in this contradiction. The affinity between rights and language is testified to by Cotta's remark that an author has more rights than ordinary people. That is to say, if you have a language, especially the dominant language, the language that the majority of people in a given society accept, then you have more rights. Conversely, rights are made up in and by language. We can summarize Kong's character by saying that he abandons his rights in order to maintain his dignity. He finds rights and personal dignity incompatible. This is a strong antithesis to the modern doctrine. From this peculiar relation to language, Kong can have what the narrator calls the courage of good feelings. Quote, In a certain sense, it might well be said that his was an exemplary life. He was one of those rare people, rare in our town as elsewhere, who have the courage of their good feelings. What little he told of his personal life vouched for acts of kindness and a capacity for affection that no one in our times dares own to." Unquote. In short, he has this abundance of goodness precisely from the position of not relenting to the language that is imposed on him. We will find out soon the exact nature of his private work, on account of which his evenings are sacred. One thing that I can say at this point is that it has something to do with inventing his own language, inventing a language that does not give in to the existing conventions, a language that is singular in his own use. Allow me to add one final point. Having considered these details about Grand, Dr. Rieu has the following conclusion, the gist of which we already encountered earlier. Quote, "He realized how absurd it was, but he simply couldn't believe that a pestilence on the great scale could befall a town where people like Grand were to be found, obscure functionaries cultivating harmless eccentricities. To be precise, he couldn't picture such eccentricities existing in a plague-stricken community. And he concluded that the chances were all against the plagues making any headway among our fellow citizens." Unquote. To put it simply, Rieu sees a contradiction between Grand and the plague. He considers Grand as a proof against the plague. This view is extraordinarily interesting. It gives clues to the textual significance of the plague in its metaphorical sense, if you will. The novel will make much of this reflection by Rieu, as we will see shortly. This concludes our lecture today. Until next time.